I've heard I'm supposed to give a little background here. So I grew up in Ohio, and from there went to Harvard University and the University of Michigan Medical School. My folks tell me that I was telling them I wanted to be a doctor when I was 8 years old. At least that's the first they heard of it. So I guess I made it through college and medical school. I wanted to be a family doc. So after that I went off into a residency, as it's called after medical school, in family medicine, and that was out in Seattle. Well, when I was about done with that residency, I ran into a couple of folks who had problems. They just weren't getting better with all the conventional means. And one of those ladies brought in a book and said, "It says right here, vitamin E will get rid of my problem." Now, she tried every single drug that she could think of, and in fact one of them was making her ears ring and barely controlling her symptoms. So I asked her, why was she asking me about vitamin E? If she could just go down to the health food store and buy the stuff. She says, well, I want to make sure that vitamin E is not going to kill me, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, and you know, those government agencies are telling us we're going to kill ourselves with fat-soluble vitamins. So I told her that one thing I knew about vitamin E was that it never killed anybody, and that's about all they told us in medical school. She said thank you and went off and got her vitamin E. Well, you know, about 6 weeks later she called back and said she was all better, and she'd had the problem for 7, 8, 9 years. She'd flushed all the medication down the toilet. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because remember, University of Michigan Medical School, they told us all about drugs and surgery and radiation and chemotherapy. But they gave us 1 hour on vitamins and minerals. So, next time somebody came in and had a problem that hadn't been handled by the various drugs and so forth that we'd all been educated in, at least we thought we were educated at the time, and I didn't have any answer for it. Well, I thought, geez, why don't I go get me a copy of that book that had the vitamin E in it? So I did, and it said vitamin B6 would do the job. So I passed that along to the person I was working with, and doggone it, vitamin B6 didn't do the job. Oh, okay, about that point I figured there was a problem with my education. So I got the book, and fortunately it had all the footnotes in the bottom of where they got their information. Oh, and for those who are interested, that was Adele Davis's book. Some of you may remember Adele Davis. And I took it off the medical library and found that there was all kinds of information right in the medical library that nobody had ever bothered to teach us about. So that was about 1972. At that time, I started collecting photocopied articles from medical journals, scientific journals, chemical journals, agricultural journals, any kind of journal that had to do with human physiology, I guess we could call it that, diet, vitamins, minerals, natural hormones, biochemistry, botanicals, all that. And started collecting those articles, putting them in file cabinets, cross-referencing them. Oh yeah, I read them too, that's kind of helpful. And that started, I think, because I don't remember any other, let's call them database collections from the scientific literature that focus on what's now called alternative medicine, and sooner or later will just be called real medicine. I think that was the very first one that started into an extensive collection. Started up in 1972, kept that going through the 70s, was joined in that effort in 1978 by Dr. Alan Gaby, and the two of us have now put together a collection of photocopied things from medical journals that runs to 40,000, 50,000 articles somewhere in there, and either Dr. Gaby or myself has read it, put a title on it, filed it away, and we've used that as a large part of the basis for what we do in our medical practices. We can look up diabetes and what does vitamin B3 do, or we can go the other way and look up vitamin A and what's it good for. In this file, well, we collected enough, and let's see, I'm getting my words mixed up, excuse me. That was 1972. In 1973, I thought, you know, we could actually do a whole lot for healthcare without using all the drugs and chemotherapy and so forth. So I left the clinic I was and started something called Tahoma Clinic, which started in '73, and here it is, the year 2000. It's still going. There's 9 of us practitioners there now, and nurses and technicians, and there's a laboratory associated and a dispensary, and altogether we have about 80 folks working on site, trying to help folks get better and to prevent disease. And that's all at the Tahoma Clinic and the associated lab, Meridian Valley Lab, which is one of the first that takes care of doctors' lab tests in this field. And they make a dispensary with all the specialty products. But getting back to where I think I took off, in 1973, I'd been collecting that information. I was joined at the Tahoma Clinic by Dr. Gaby in 1978. He stayed with us till 1981, then he moved back east. Oh, by the way, we're in Seattle, a little town called Kent, near Seattle, Washington. And Dr. Gaby joined that effort in 1978, and he and I, based on our clinical experience and based on all this enormous mass of information right in the scientific journals that to this day is not very well taught in medical schools, we started teaching a course. I think we called it Clinical Applications of Nutritional Biochemistry in 1983, and we've taught that course 13 or 14 times between '83 and the present. First time we had 65 doctors attend. And they thought we knew something, and we were happy. So we put it on again and collected all the information from the literature some more and compiled it all into, well, for diabetes you can do this, and you can use vitamin C this way, and so forth. During the 80s, the course would have 60, 80, 150 people. Last time the course was taught in 1998, we had 460 doctors there, all wanting to learn about the nutritional medicine. And without bragging too much, that course from 1983 to present has been the #1 course teaching doctors how to do this in the field. Well, Dr. Gaby and I have some books out, but 1976, or was it 1979? It was 1979. That's what was 1976. Excuse me, I need my memory vitamins. In 1976, I got a call from Prevention Magazine. Some of you may know Prevention Magazine. And I started writing a monthly health column for them. That went from 1976 to 1986. 1986 to 1996, I wrote a monthly column for Let's Live magazine. In addition to working with folks in the office, one of the things I've tried to do is get the information out there, both in the courses that Dr. Gaby and I give, and in books and magazine articles and so forth, for anybody who wants to read them and prevent disease, and for their families themselves, and to keep themselves better. So I started writing for them in 1976, and I think by the time I got done with those magazines, it turned out 250 articles or so, one a month. 1979, I wrote a book called Book of Nutritional Therapy. I'm not sure, but I think it was the first very big seller in this field. By the time it ran its course, it had sold nearly 500,000 copies. And we followed that up in 1984 with another one called Guide to Healing with Nutrition, and that sold another couple 100,000 copies. Just trying to get the information out, in addition to working with folks one at a time, one by one in my clinic. Now, I hope y'all can hear this. I'm told sometimes I speak too low, so I'll try to speak up a little bit, excuse me. Let's see, what else might be interesting. In the 1970s, I'd read enough of this medical literature that I was able to put together a treatment for kids with asthma that, in so-called alternative medicine anyway, is still the mainstay for kids with asthma. In fact, if a child comes into my office or the office of another doctor who does vitamins and minerals and all, wheezing, and we apply this treatment, about half those kids don't have their wheezing problem anymore in a month, and about another 30% of them have a major improvement. Now, that was the 70s, and you might not have heard of this by now, and that's a little bit sad. A lot of drugs are given for kids with asthma, and unfortunately we're told that more and more kids are dying of asthma every year. And this treatment's so simple. Now, it doesn't cure the allergies. It takes the wheezing away, and that's what people die of. People still have to pay attention to their allergies and not eat the wrong food and so on and so on. But the treatment that takes the wheezing away, that actually was right there in the medical literature, and all I had to do was piece it together from this article and that article and the other one, had to do with vitamin B12. And to this day, if we give little ones with asthma a vitamin B12 injection, yeah, it's an injection, and that's kind of hard on the kids, but it's a shot. It doesn't work too well if we don't inject it. If we swallow it, sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. If we give them that every day for a month, after that month, half the kids aren't wheezing anymore, and then we can just taper on down. And the other half, well, there's still some wheezing, but another 30%, they're much, much better. Maybe 20% aren't affected too much. That would make big inroads in all the little ones we have with asthma if we could just spread this out. So I'm hoping if you're watching this, I've certainly written in books about it and put it on magazine articles. Maybe you can tell somebody you know who has a child with asthma. In the early 80s, I had a woman come on into my office who said she wanted prescription for some hormones. She's going through menopause. So I got out the prescription pads, started writing the prescription. And I guess luckily she can read upside down, because she looked over and said, "But I want natural hormones." This is 1982. I told her, well, hey, they told me at the University of Michigan these are natural. This is Premarin. Comes from horses, and horses are natural. Well, she pointed out something that, ding, I should have noticed. She said, "I'm not a horse. I want some hormones for people. Those hormones over there, they're for horses. And you know, horses are this big, and they got 4 legs and everything." And I said, well, gee, you know, hadn't thought of that, but you're right. These aren't exactly the same hormones that women have in their bodies prior to menopause. She said, well, I want some of those. I'm probably paraphrasing her. She was probably more polite. And I told her that they weren't available. Big drug companies didn't want to make them because they're not patentable, and we couldn't get them anywhere. Well, she's an awful confident lady. She got up and said, well, I'm sure you can find them. I'll be back in 2 or 3 months. So to try to shorten this up a little, I worked with a compounding pharmacist. We were able to get the formulation together, and that's where the first prescription for something that's now called triple estrogen, that from one compounding pharmacy is available now in 2,000 compounding pharmacies in the United States. That's where it came from, is this lady who told me she didn't want to be a horse, or didn't want horse hormones anyway. So since that time, I've been prescribing the identical to natural, we're calling them bioidentical now, hormones. Now you can't say I invented it. All I did was copy what's in women's bodies. So I can say I was the first good copycat. And just incidentally, if you've never heard this before, natural medicine is not all that hard. All we have to do is observe exactly the way our bodies work, biochemically and bioenergetically, and the way we fit in with nature, and things that are out there in nature that folks can use. And then we just have to copy that original blueprint as closely as we can. And the whole problem with the way I was educated, and the way, if you can call it that, most of the people that you'll see in this series were educated, is we learned all about anatomy and physiology and biochemistry, and then when it comes to doing something, why, we learned to give these drug things that never have been found in human bodies before. So what I've tried to do ever since 1972 is to work with things that belong in the body, that the body is accustomed to, the body can handle, either essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, essential fatty acids, identical to natural hormones, botanicals, and only use the drugs if we absolutely have to and there isn't any better alternative. Well, getting back to, I guess, what I'm supposed to be talking about, more or less. Also in 1982, I think, that in one of the articles and in one of the books I wrote, I think I was the first to put out there the use of DHEA. Now, I certainly didn't make up DHEA. Remember, that's in all our bodies. And I didn't do the basic research. That was done at universities. But insofar as putting it into general everyday practice, well, that was a good year, 1982. We did bioidentical estrogens. We did DHEA. And then I'm sure you all know that Dr. John Lee at the same time was working on natural progesterone. So there we have a program of identical to natural estrogens and progesterone and DHEA, and certainly identical to natural testosterone, that we've been working with at our clinic at Tahoma Clinic since 1982. Along about 1997, it seemed about time to write a book on that. So with a co-author, Mr. Morgenthaler, we put out a book, Natural Hormone Replacement for Women over 45, and I'm happy to say that some 200,000 of everyone has bought that, and we've got that information out there so that people can be better informed about not having to take horse hormones or synthetic hormones or other things that don't belong in the body. And we followed up on that with Dr. Leonard with a book on testosterone replacement, as well as the vitamins and minerals and botanicals that we can use. And that one came out in 1999, so it hasn't quite sold 200,000 copies yet. That's probably not important, but getting the information out is, and that's an indicator of getting the information out. Another thing that occurred in our practice, and my practice in the mid-1980s, had to do with a child 4 or 5 years old, I think she's about that, whose parents brought her in because of multiple kidney infections, just many, many, many. And she'd been told at our local university hospital that because they were running out of antibiotics that were effective on her anymore, that she'd probably be going into kidney failure and needing a kidney transplant. And parents brought her in, isn't there anything we can do with natural medicine? Well, fortunately, Mom had kept a big scrapbook of all the things her child had had to go through, including all the doctors she'd seen and so forth. And in there she had the reports on the infections, and they all turned out to be the most common type of bladder infection, and that's one caused by a bacteria called E. coli. Now that is not the same as the E. coli OH157 that we all hear about these days, that gets into contaminated meat because unfortunately the food processing is being done not quite clean enough, and people eat that and they land in the hospital with kidney failure and they die. That's a mutant E. coli. I'm talking about the normal E. coli, normal in quotes, that's found in all mammals, it's found in people, and it's in the intestines, it's helping to digest food, and it's making vitamins and things. And basically, it's one of the so-called normal internal microflora that we're all told by research scientists we couldn't exist without. And they probably couldn't exist without us either, so we all get along. And these E. coli, as unfortunately women know better than men, have a bad habit of crawling around into the wrong place and making infections. It's that kind of E. coli, not the absolutely deadly ones. Well, this little one, it had so many infections with this E. coli, so what we did was to find a simple sugar. It's called D-mannose, for what that's worth. And I know a name like mannose isn't politically correct anymore, but there it is. And this simple sugar has the very, very fortunate effect of attaching itself to the E. coli bacteria like Teflon, so that the bacteria can no longer stick to the walls of the bladder or the urinary tract, and so every time a person urinates, there goes all the bacteria. Now, it's not an antibiotic, it doesn't kill bacteria, it just simply makes it impossible for them to stick in the bladder. And this is also a simple sugar, which is mostly not metabolized by our bodies, but extremely safe. No one ever got hurt with this stuff. A little bit of it's metabolized, less than 5%, and 95% or more just gets into the system, gets in the bloodstream, and out through the kidneys again, and if there happen to be any E. coli in there, just rinses them away. So this little one, who was 5 at the time, and she's nearly 20 now, went on to quantities of the D-mannose. Remember, it's a sugar. It tastes good. Can you imagine that? A medicine that works and actually tastes good? So Mom just stirred it into water for her daughter every 3-4 hours. And she had to do that every 3-4 hours all day. But from that time till now, and that was 1985 or 6 or something, she's only had one more bladder infection, and that was when they went on vacation and forgot to take the D-mannose with them. Well, it didn't just work for her. We've used that at the clinic now for 15 years. And 3-4 years ago, I thought, well, even though it's not in all those scientific papers I just told you about, for this particular use, well, over 10 years was good enough. I guess I could tell people about it, even though there wasn't all the scientific references that I like to have when I tell people about stuff. And so now you can find D-mannose in most natural food stores and many of the compounding pharmacies. And since these E. coli infections make up better than 90% of all bladder infections, we actually need only 1/10 or less the number of antibiotics that are currently being written for and used for urinary tract infection, and we can get by with a simple sugar. Now, I guess the reason I brought that up is to illustrate that there are a whole lot of things in nature that we can use to solve problems which still aren't being solved that way. What else is there to talk about? Let's do a little politics. Sometimes that's fun. Well, in 1992, we were having an average clinic day at the Tahoma Clinic, and just before we were about to unlock our doors for the day, there was this big old banging on the doors, and somebody kicked in the front doors, and they came in running through the side doors and the back door, and these fellas were holding guns, and they were yelling, "Raid, raid, raid!" And it wasn't an insecticide commercial. It was like one of those Cops episodes. And you know, it would have been funny, except those were real guns. Now, I'm a Second Amendment supporter, so I'm happy that most of them had them pointed toward the ceiling. But they did point one right at our receptionist and say, "Hands up!" And she put her hands up, and she wanted to know, and gee, that light just came on. This must have been something. She wanted to know if they couldn't get an appointment, they didn't have to come in with a gun, did they? Well, they told her to shut up and so forth, and actually, if it hadn't been for real and gotten everybody's adrenaline going, it would have been funny, because they actually presented a search warrant, and we read the search warrant, and they were there to arrest our B vitamins. No, I'm not kidding. They were there to arrest our vitamin B complex and our vitamin B12 and some vitamin C and some herbal extracts, and all of these, by the way, were injectable. And they wanted them because they had the misfortune to be made in Germany, even though we bought them here in the United States. Only reason I'm bringing this up is that at that time, one of our favorite federal agencies, FDA, was before the Congress asking for more and more power to regulate vitamins and minerals and botanicals and this and that. And I guess they were just demonstrating how much power they didn't have with this guns-loaded raid. And very fortunately, a lot of the people who come to our clinic, why, they arrived for their appointments and they were turned away, and they started calling up the local radio and the television and the newspapers and everything, and it actually turned into a fairly big deal. We're told by some White House officials that they had to install a special fax line at the White House, and before they were done, they got 25,000 faxes and who knows how many phone calls about this raid. There was a letter to the editor of the newspaper by somebody who was writing about it, saying, "Here I was sitting in the McDonald's eating a Big Mac, drinking my coffee, smoking a cigarette, and watching a cocaine deal go down across the street, and I saw the news flash about the B vitamin raid, and I'm sure happy the government was protecting me against those B vitamins." Well, that's the kind of publicity it got. And the congressional hearing that was being held about giving the FDA more power, well, gee, that sort of got called to a halt. And we think that by sitting there and getting ourselves rated by FDA, we may have contributed to the turnaround in the United States, which needs more turning around, please. Help us on that, folks. But we contributed to the turnaround that led to the change in the law allowing for vitamins, minerals, botanicals, and so forth to be used more openly and freely. The big step was now people can put things on the market that are natural without having to get all this permission, as long as they're safe and natural. We still have one other step. We still can't tell you what to do with them. What do I mean by that? Ever pick up a bottle of vitamin E and look at the label? It says vitamin E, 400 units. What's it for? We're not supposed to tell anybody what it's for. But at least we can put it on the market now. And we couldn't do, well, we could do vitamin E, but we couldn't do near the range of natural substances before the change in the law that happened in 1994, which was partly a result of that B vitamin raid on our clinic in 1992. In case you're ever wondering what the outcome of that raid was, why, that agency went through 2 grand juries, no indictments were handed down. Who knows, maybe the grand jurors were taking their B vitamins and they didn't mind. And after 3 years and $350,000 in legal defense funds, and for those of you who are watching this who contributed to our legal defense fund, thank you. Thank you very much. We wouldn't have made it. Our clinic couldn't have afforded it. Anyway, after all that, that agency just dropped the case without telling us. We read about it in the newspapers. The case was dropped. Well, that's good. We're happy the case was dropped and that we can contribute in some way to what we think is political progress in this field. Well, the politics were fun and perhaps entertaining in retrospect, but what's more important is continuing to look at that basic research. We're very happy to see that many, many more universities are now inventing natural medicine. And they come up with, well, look at what vitamin C will do, and look at what vitamin B will do, and so forth. And we're happy to just smile. In case we knew it all along, why tell them? Let anybody who wants to take the credit, just so the information's out there so that folks can take care of themselves and that's themselves too, with the help of their doctors when they need it, in a more sound, natural, safe, and effective manner, so that hopefully the use of those things that we call pharmaceuticals, but what we really ought to call them is patent medicines, because that's what they are, and the use of chemotherapy and radiation will decline as we do more, we being the scientific community, basic research in natural medicine and vitamins and minerals and herbs. And I keep on collecting all that literature and putting it into effect, and so do the 8 other doctors at our clinic now. And those of you who are watching this can help out in that effort by joining what we like to call the movement for healthcare freedom. Let me tell you about one other thing, speaking of basic research that we're doing at the clinic, that comes from looking at all that old literature. Now, why we call medical writing literature after we read Shakespeare, nobody knows, but we still call it literature. But it comes from reading that and putting it to use. In the AMA Journal in 1944, a doctor from the Mayo Clinic talked about the use of intravenous histamine for multiple sclerosis, and he said that better than 60% of 100 patients who he'd worked with had a major improvement, not a cure, but a major improvement in their multiple sclerosis by the use of this natural substance histamine. Well, you know, that was used from the 1940s till the early 50s. It just sort of died out. And then this decade, a nurse who had MS herself, Elaine Delac, figured out a way that it could be used in a transdermal patch instead of IV. Well, right as I'm talking to you, we're finishing up a double-blind, placebo-controlled research project on this material and MS, and it looks like it's really helping folks. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you do a lot more watching and reading in this field to be able to take care of yourself and your family, and anybody you'd like to talk to about their health. Thanks.